Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about Machiavelli and the Prince and the principle. Yes?
For like the exams and stuff, is it going to be based on the PowerPoints or the readings?
Both. Other questions? Okay, so Machiavelli and military power, the use of force, monopolies of violence, and next time we will talk about social contracts when we talk about Hobbes. So just a reminder to you, remember there's no class next Monday, or next Tuesday rather, so the next time we meet is Thursday. And so you should be sure to do the reading from Hobbes for that evening's meeting, and also to bring your book. So, first of all, what's military power? Michael Mann says military power is the social organization of concentrated and lethal violence. So it's not just the use of an army. Military power is any power that relies on actual force or the threat of force. And as I mentioned in the last class, it is by far the most pervasive kind of power, historically speaking, and it's usually there now mainly as the threat of violence to support and undergird other kinds of force that are, other kinds of power rather, that are being exercised. So the first question is, why is violence necessary? Yes?
It instills fear that the people, I guess like they don't want to go against if you were like the ruler, that maybe something would happen to them or to their family or their loved ones. So
yeah, that's a big one. So it's the idea that it's a deterrent, and you hear this a lot in, say, arguments about the death penalty, right? If you see that for a particular crime that you might lose your life, that will be a kind of deterrent, a kind of preventive against you committing that kind of crime. And most violence actually is done, particularly when it's being done by somebody that holds other kinds of power, particularly political power. Violence is usually done for precisely that reason, to prevent other people from getting out of line. Because as I mentioned in the last class also, violence is expensive and it has diminishing returns as it's used for lengthier periods of time. You run a greater and greater risk that the people that are on your side are going to get hurt as well, and then you're going to run the risk of losing the support of those people, and then that's trouble for you. Any other reasons why violence is necessary, other than deterrence? Yeah. Yeah, it can definitely be a form of punishment. And this is related to the death penalty argument as well, insofar as if you kill somebody, then you're not going to have them as a problem anymore. Right? So at the very least, those people that would argue in favor of the death penalty would say that, well, if you execute somebody that's committed murder, you can be sure that they'll never commit murder again. And in political situations, in situations where people that hold varying levels of power come into conflict, then punishment, killing somebody, sometimes comes into play as well, although less often as history sort of goes forward. Is there anything else that we're forgetting? So violence is a problem-solving device more than anything else, which means that although it's the last resort, or supposed to be the last resort, it is nevertheless ultimately, when things can't be resolved in another way, particularly between countries, but often within countries as well, it's the way that problems then get solved. So a very famous theoretician of war from 19th century Germany named Karl Clausewitz, and you don't need to know that, but you need to know the idea, which is that he said that war is just the extension of politics by other means. When political means fail, then you go to war. Now, it's also true that not everybody's going to wait until is going to use war as the last resort. Some people will use it sooner rather than later. And the last thing is that, you know, it can be a highly persuasive way of getting people to do what you want them to do. You know, if I say, give me $5, you can just say no and walk away. If I hold a gun at you and I say, give me $5, then you're frankly more likely to give me $5. And that's because of the threat of the immediate use of force. So it's not a moral thing, mind you. It's just something that is a way of persuading people that might otherwise be reluctant to bend your will. Second question is, why is organized violence necessary? And when I say organized violence, I mean that, and we'll talk about this more in the next class, but we generally operate under an agreement that certain people within our society are allowed to use violence more than others. So, we give the police a particular amount of leeway to use force that we don't give to anybody else in our society. We give, for that matter, we give the ability of the military to kill other people within specific, conditions on battlefields, and there are limits to what they're allowed to do. But the general understanding is that when we recruit people into a military and we send them out onto a battlefield, that their job there is to kill the other person. We don't allow that in any other circumstance. So the question is, why do we allow some people to commit violence and other people not to? Yeah, Lauren? Yeah, well, that's a big one, right? So the argument that if we just allowed everybody to act violently of their own accord, that it would degenerate or remain a situation of anarchy, of lawlessness, of everybody just beating up everybody else for what they want or need, or because they disagree with the other person. So at some point there is an agreement that's made among people living in societies, and it's not a sort of a formal moment as like, before this moment we don't have the agreement and afterwards we do. It's an evolutionary process that takes place over hundreds, if not thousands of years. We decide that we're going to give the ability to use violence to some people and not others. And last but not least, what are the limits of violence? What can violence not accomplish? Yeah.
You can't oppress other people for long periods of time.
Yeah, at some point, that's an excellent point. So, and what he said was that you can't oppress people, particularly with violence, but I would argue you can't really oppress people at all for extended periods of time without risk of them revolting, of rising up against you. And if you put it in the extreme condition of the use of physical violence, say, or even just, bad economic conditions, or high taxes that are onerous and that you can't make a living otherwise. At some point, the people will say, "Well, I literally would rather be dead than go on doing this," and the benefits of perhaps winning in fighting against the person that is oppressing you will outweigh the negative consequences of you doing so and losing. If you feel like you have nothing else to lose, then violence is not going to seem like that big of a threat to you. And that's why there's other kinds of power, basically. Because nobody can maintain power long enough using just violence that they won't turn enough people against them that ultimately they're going to fail in what they're trying to do. So, our author for this evening is Niccolo Machiavelli, and the book that we're looking at tonight in part is called The Prince. So Machiavelli himself lives in Italy in the late 15th and early 16th century. And to give you some idea of the geography of Italy at the time, it was not a unified country. In fact, it was not a unified country until the middle of the 19th century, which is something we'll talk about weeks down the road. But for now, the important thing to bear in mind is that because it's a divided country with multiple monarchies and a couple of republics that are occupying the peninsula, it means that there is frequent conflict between these small states, none of which is really sort of powerful enough at any given time to either conquer the others, or for that matter, to prevent people from outside Italy from becoming involved in the politics of Italy. So it's why, for instance, when you look at Sardinia, and it says in parentheses Aragon, which is a province of Spain, it just means that that island is being ruled by Spain. So for that matter is Sicily. The important places that we'll talk about tonight are the Republic of Florence, which is here. Capital is Florence. And the Papal States. So the Papal States are centered on Rome, where the Pope lives. And here's the important thing to remember about the Catholic Church and the papacy until the 19th century, is that it wasn't just a religious organization like it is today. It was a very powerful geopolitical organization as well. And the Pope was one of the most powerful people on earth, not only because he commanded the largest religious organization on earth, it's still the case today, but because that religious organization had armies. And in particular, beyond just having armies, he also had land. He had that whole strip in yellow that goes across the peninsula. And that was had the armed force that the Pope commanded there, but then through alliances, through religious leadership, so on and so forth, the Pope could then also pit other armed forces against each other. Most importantly, from an historical standpoint, Spain, after it was unified, and that's happening around the same time but has not yet fully happened, Spain will be essentially the military arm of the Catholic Church for hundreds of years. It's one of the reasons why Spain conquers as broadly as it does. So, Machiavelli himself is from Florence. And an important family at that time in Florence is the Medici family. The Medici family, Medici, as noted on the slide. The Medici family makes its money from banking, and as a result of agglomerating economic power over the course of a couple of centuries, becomes a major political force as well. And at the time that the Prince is being written, I should say, the Medicis have returned to power after being kicked out for a certain period of time. And in doing so, they also then elect one of their own to be the Pope, which is a common occurrence in this period, historically speaking, as well. If a family is powerful enough, wealthy enough, they can usually rig things in the College of Cardinal to get their guy elected Pope. While this Pope is ruling in Rome, Leo X, while the Medici family is returned to power in Florence, Machiavelli, who has been an ally of the previous regime in Florence and the previous Pope, who came from that regime, is thrown in prison. And it's when he's in prison that he writes this book called The Prince. The details here are less important because they're actually described in the readings from tonight, and we'll go into them in more detail. The key thing is that Machiavelli writes this while he's in prison, and he does so basically to get himself into the good graces of this Medici family that has most recently returned to power. So the title in Italian, Il Principe, means the ruler, not the prince like the son of a king or somebody of royal blood. It just means somebody that rules a territory of some kind. And as noted, Machiavelli writes this as a guidebook for rulers. And basically, the argument of the book is, well, suppose that you are a prince, a ruler of a principality, of an area, a territory, and it's your responsibility to govern this place. What is your greatest concern if you're in that situation? And his answer is, your greatest concern is going to be maintaining that position. And so here he says in The Prince is a guidebook for you to follow. In a series of situations, questions will arise for you, and the answers you're going to find here. He dedicates it to a nobleman from the Medici family named Lorenzo de' Medici, which is sort of part of our indication of why he writes it and for whom specifically. And this is sort of the most important part. The idea is that what is done in The Prince is the triumph of realism over idealism. So later in the term, we'll look at stuff that's considerably older than The Prince. Right. So we'll look at Plato's Republic, that's 2,500 years old. We'll look at the laws from Cicero, that's about 2,000 years old. The Prince is about 500 years old, so significantly newer. We look at political philosophy from the ancient world. A lot of what the political philosophy in the ancient world is concerned with is, well, what would be the best way of doing things? What would be the ideal city, for instance, is the question that Plato wants to concern himself with in Republic. And Machiavelli says that doesn't actually really matter. To have the ideal situation, first of all, is unlikely, and second of all, isn't going to help you as a potential ruler maintain your power. Realism, understanding what's at stake when a difficult situation arises and having a concrete solution to that problem, that's actually really valuable. That's a valuable political philosophy for you, a potential ruler, to have. And so when we say the triumph of realism over idealism, we're saying the triumph of politics as it actually is versus politics as the way you feel like it hopefully might be someday. So, any questions so far? So, I asked you to look at 5 chapters from The Prince, beginning with this one. And one last question to sort of talk about broadly in discussing military power before we look at the text directly is, why do countries go to war? Yeah. Yeah, so that's a key reason why countries go to war. Multiple explanations are often given for why countries go to war, but the most common reason is that there's some resource at stake, and that therefore that resource can't be negotiated in a non-peaceful way, or one side or both sides, for that matter, don't care to negotiate in any kind of peaceful way, and so they go to force. Now, assume for a moment that war is not desirable, and that it's something that you would seek to avoid. Then why would you go to war? Why not just make some agreement whereby resources can be shared? Yeah.
Maybe countries want to feel superior to the others.
That's possible, and certainly that's historically been the case sometimes. And here's the counter-argument to that. The counter-argument to that is, well, but what good does it for me to be superior if, like, a bunch of my guys are dead because I made them go into a war that could have been avoided? Yeah.
Actually, I thought that too, but it's just things like paranoia, I guess. You're not, I guess it's like, you go to war too for communication issues.
In part, but here's the big thing. Are resources just, infinite? Yeah, I mean, ultimately you're going to come across a situation where there's resources at stake, and I need them on one side and you need them on the other side, and the fact that one of us has them and the other one doesn't means that the other side's going to lose in a big way. And when a situation like that one arises, oftentimes war is really has to be gone to, and it's one of the reasons why so much energy and time goes into preventing wars and making sure that situations like that don't emerge in the first place. It's why we have things like, international trade deals today, to make sure that countries don't become so resource poor that they have no alternative but to go to war. It's not just that war is terrible, which obviously it is, and we want to avoid it. It's also that, we recognize that resources being scarce, it's better that we avoid the initial cause when it's resources to the extent that we can. So that's why countries go to war. The other question is, well, if you go to war and by virtue of going to war acquire territory, then at what point does it become necessary for you to just continue a cycle of violence in order to maintain that territory? And that's really what these chapters are about. When you acquire new territory as a prince, as a ruler, what is the best way to make sure that you're able to manage that territory that you've acquired? And Machiavelli says, okay, well, let's look at the different possible scenarios under which you got your hands on this territory in the first place. And we'll see then what the answer is. So the first chapter, concerning the way to govern cities or principalities which lived under their own laws before they were annexed. So you have a situation in which you have an independent territory that had its own laws, and now you, the ruler of some other territory, now have come to acquire that territory. So this is a relatively short chapter. I think it's just 3 paragraphs, so let's sort of dive right in. Whenever those states which have been acquired as stated have been accustomed to live under their own laws and in freedom, there are 3 courses for those who wish to hold them. The first is to ruin them. The next is to reside there in person. The third is to permit them to live under their own laws, drawing a tribute and establishing within it an oligarchy which will keep it friendly to you. So that's a lot to sort of unpack. A couple of words that are maybe not so clear. So the first thing is, well, there's 3 things for you to do if you acquire an independent country that had its own rules and ways of doing things. The first is just to destroy it. That way, the problem is basically solved. The second is to actually just go live there as the ruler. And that way, you'll be able to sort of keep a close hand on the situation in case things get out of control. The third thing he says is to draw a tribute and establish an oligarchy, and that's sort of where it gets a little bit more difficult. So a tribute just means like that they'll pay you in order to leave them alone. And the second thing, establishing an oligarchy means you're going to choose some group from within that country to do the running of things for you. So an oligarchy literally just sort of means rule by an elite. It can be an economic elite, it can be a cultural elite. When we talk about elites, basically we mean the people that for whatever reason have risen to the top of a hierarchy within the society. And depending on, the different echelons within the society, that can be a political elite, it can be a cultural elite, it can be a military elite. Any number of different kinds of elites can exist. Often there sort of is a very strong correlation between socioeconomic status and elite status, right? If you come from a wealthy background, the more likely it is you're going to be in an elite group within your particular country or culture. So these are the 3 opportunities, right? You destroy the place, you go live there yourself, and you establish basically collaborators. And you get money from it in order to keep it protected. It's sort of it's the same way as if you open a store in a shady neighborhood and people come to you one day and they say you have a really nice store. It would be a shame if something happened to it, and then the understanding is made that if you give a little bit of your money to them, that they will protect it from anything happening to it, including, and most importantly by them. So because such a government being created by the prince knows that it cannot stand without his friendship and interest and does its utmost to support him, and therefore he would keep a city accustomed to freedom, will hold it more easily by means of its own citizens than in any other way. So why is choosing some elite group and oligarchy from among the native population beneficial? Because people don't want to be ruled by people that aren't like them. They don't want to be ruled by foreigners. They want to be ruled by their own people. Even if it is sort of the hand of a foreign power that's doing it, They're going to be more comfortable with the idea of the people that are doing the day-to-day practice of statecraft look like them and talk like them. So just to sort of give you an example, why was it that the British Empire was able to maintain control over the second largest country in the world, India, for 100 years with a number of people in the low 5 figures? And the answer is, obviously, importantly, overwhelming military force, but the actual sort of explosions of physical violence in India when it was under British occupation were relatively rare. What made it effective was having a local elite that was willing to do the dirty work when the dirty work needed to be done, and that otherwise was willing to do things like collect taxes and run factories and do all of the day-to-day work of why the British were there in the first place. If it was just an alien force of British there doing everything, then the willingness of the people, force or no force, would have been exhausted much more quickly. And then the examples: the Spartans, the Romans. And the example to remember of one of these is the Romans. So the Romans, he says, in order to hold Capua, Carthage, and Numantia, dismantled them and did not lose them. So there's example number one, right? If you want to be sure that you're not going to have any problem from a territory that you have conquered, then destroy it. So the Romans, Carthage was in what's now Tunisia in North Africa, and of course Romans in Rome. And the Carthaginians were like their first historic enemy. They fought multiple wars with them, and finally they defeated them. And when they did, they just destroyed the city. They destroyed the city so much to the extent that not only did they, tear the walls of the city down, kill the men, enslave the women, sell the children off into slavery, that kind of thing, but they also then literally salted the earth at the site so that nobody could farm there for a generation. Problem solved, right? I mean, if you don't want to deal with an enemy that has been a thorn in your side, then completely eradicating them and where they live is going to be a pretty efficient way of doing that. Pick up here. And he who becomes master of a city accustomed to freedom and does not destroy it may expect to be destroyed by it. For in rebellion it has always the watchword of liberty and its ancient privileges as a rallying point, which neither time nor benefits will ever cause it to forget. And whatever you may do or provide against, they never forget that name or their privileges unless they are disunited or dispersed, but at every chance they immediately rally to them, as Pisa after the 100 years she had been held in bondage by the Florentines. Pisa held in bondage by the Florentines. Can you imagine? So here's the point. The point is that you have to do this not only because it gets rid of the enemy in the immediate case, but also because if you leave the people in the city and you rule over them by way of, say, living there, there's going to be a constant sort of whispering campaign against you. They're going to remember their defeat. They're going to consistently sort of ruminate over that, and their desire for revenge is not going to go away. Because they're different people than you are. They have their own customs and traditions, and you're not going to be able to dispel those, particularly while you allow them to live together in the land that's theirs. Remember, this is not a moral philosophy, right? This is a philosophy of how do you accomplish the goal that you have before you. You conquer territory, you want to continue to have it. This is going to be the most effective way of doing so. Last part of this chapter. When cities or countries are accustomed to live under a prince and his family is exterminated, they, being on the one hand accustomed to obey, and on the other hand, not having the old prince, cannot agree in making one from amongst themselves, and they do not know how to govern themselves. So here's his sort of middle ground. If there's a previous guy like you in the city that you're marching into, one way of sort of effectively getting the situation under control is to kill that guy and his family, and then that will leave that'll leave a power vacuum. Like nobody will really know what to do among that group, and then that vacuum is one in which you can walk in. For this reason, they are slow to take up arms, and a prince can gain them to himself and secure them much more easily. Not only then do you have the troublesome leader out of the way, but you can then sort of court a group or a few among them, draw them to your side, and sort of cement your rule there a little bit more easily. But he says the safest way is to destroy them or to reside there. Next chapter, concerning new principalities which are acquired by one's own arms and ability. So what if you are the person what if it's sort of your own city that you come to rule over? And you do so either by rebellion, leading an army there, or you've risen, by a claim or through politics or what have you. How do you then maintain control in that situation? He says, in entirely new principalities where there is a new prince, more or less difficulty is found in keeping them accordingly as there is more or less ability in him who has acquired the state. That sort of is a preamble to the next point. And he's just really sort of in that line summarizing what's gone on in the last chapter. In a new principality, you have the problems that I've mentioned a moment ago. Now, as the fact of becoming a prince from a private station presupposes either ability or fortune, it is clear that one or the other of these two things will mitigate in some degree many difficulties. Well, if you are good in battle, that's going to serve you well when you come into this position. And if you were good in politics or whatever it was that brought you up to the top in the first place, that's going to serve you well also. Nevertheless, he who has relied least on fortune is established the strongest. Further, it facilitates matters when the prince being no other state is compelled to reside there in person. So this is the proposition he makes. If the weaker that the person is who comes into power, either militarily or in sort of popular opinion, that person is going to be far more likely to have to rely on force. They won't have demonstrated as well their ability to be effective as a leader, and so the demonstrations that they will have to do to make it clear to the people that they're ruling over that their rule is firm will necessarily be more extreme. And then he gives historical examples again. So a couple of these are likely familiar. Probably Moses is the most familiar, and a few of them are pretty arcane. But it's worth looking at Moses. So it says, it was necessary, therefore, to Moses that he should find the people of Israel in Egypt enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians, in order that they should be disposed to follow them so as to be delivered out of bondage. So this is the idea of the man of acclaim rising from within his own community. And Machiavelli says a couple of things. First of all, he says, well, first of all, it was important that to Moses, because he was basically unproven, that the Israelites who he came to lead were in a pretty decrepit state at that time. So they were sort of looking for a leader, and he appeared in the right place at the right time. But he says a little bit further down, grouping in Moses with the other men, but the point stands for Moses as well. If they had been unarmed, they could not have enforced their constitutions for long. So Moses comes to power over a weakened people. But even in a situation like that, it's necessary ultimately for Moses to use physical violence and force. if the only thing you know about Moses is, the Ten Commandments and, he leads the Israelites out of bondage and, 40 years in the desert and so on and so forth, take a good look at sometime, if you have the time or interest or inclination, at some of the violence in the Old Testament that's being wreaked on not just the enemies of the Israelites, but on the Israelites on a regular basis by Moses. He is very much in the mode of an ancient military leader. He's not just a religious leader. And what Machiavelli is saying is, well, Moses, he had prophetic ability and all these things that obviously drew the Israelites to his side. And it didn't hurt that they were in slavery in Egypt, so that they were sort of primed to have a good leader come along. But it wouldn't have mattered, for 40 years in the desert. For 40 years in the desert, Moses had to be a person that could rely on military power as well. The political leadership and in particular, from the standpoint of who Moses was for Jews and Christians, for the ideological power that he held, still the military power had to be in effect as well. Chapter 7, new principalities which are acquired either by the arms of others or by good fortune. So it falls into your lap, good fortune, or you didn't conquer it yourself, but it was like, willed to you, basically. Or your father conquered it and then he died and now it's yours. States that rise unexpectedly then, like all other things in nature which are born and grow rapidly, cannot have their foundations and correspondencies with other states fixed in such a way that the first storm will not overthrow them, unless, as is said, those who unexpectedly become princes are men of so much ability that they know they have to be prepared at once to hold that which fortune has thrown into their laps, and that those foundations which others have laid before them became princes, they must lay afterward. So, yeah. You can't rely on the force that brought this place into your power to continue to obtain after the person that actually exercised that force is gone. You can't rely on the administration that came before you, for that matter. For instance, if you're the president. If you're the president of the United States, the only thing that really matters is you. Doesn't matter what the previous administration did, you don't inherit that goodwill. Doesn't matter if you're the same party. So for the prince that inherits a territory that his father gave him, or that his father left to him in inheritance, you can't rest on those laurels. You have to sort of demonstrate your own ability. And so he begins to tell this story about this guy, Caesar Borgia. Caesar Borgia was a Spaniard and came from a noble family in Spain. And probably most importantly of all, his father was the Pope. Let me repeat that. His father was the Pope, right? So it was not it actually by that point was a celibate priesthood, but there were loopholes that were involved in all that. And, as I said, the church was at that point in particular a very important geopolitical force, and that wealthy families and politically powerful families could easily get elected their own family members as Pope. And that's precisely what the Borgia family did. So, and this Pope is Alexander VI. So Alexander VI is the Pope, and he wants to aggrandize, as Machiavelli says, his son, Caesar Borgia. And so he gives him territory in Italy. That territory, it turns out, is the Medici's territory. And this is the whole sort of situation that unfolds before the prince is written. So this is sort of the situation that he wants, that Machiavelli wants his reader, from the Medici family in particular, to really read and understand. Because think about the situation as it's arisen. So the Medicis have been in power in Florence for decades, and then, you know, a rival family from Spain is able to get their guy elected to the papacy, and so now their guy has a bunch of power in Italy that he didn't have before, family didn't have before. And that guy, this Pope Alexander, wants to bestow on his family power. So he takes his oldest son and says, here, you can have this land over here. I'll use my army from my papal state and help you conquer it. We'll kick out this Medici family. It'll be yours. And remember that just before Machiavelli writes The Prince, and he does it while he's in prison, the Medicis are able to come back. They're able to get rid of Caesar Borgia, and they're able to reestablish their own rule, and then to punish the people that had collaborated with Borgia, among whom was, by the way, Machiavelli. So Machiavelli says to himself when he's in prison, well, I can maybe turn this to my advantage. I can maybe, as we say, polish this turd, right? It's not a great thing that here I am in prison, but I was kind of an inside guy with this whole Borgia thing. And maybe what I can do is, because after all, think about the situation as it is once the Medici are back in power. They're going to be then bestowing a territory on their posterity for generations that follow. It's not just going to be that the Medici that's able to get rid of Caesar Borgia is going to rule it forever, right? He'll die at some point. He'll have to leave it to his kids. And then they'll be in exactly the situation that Caesar Borgia was in when his father gave him land that he didn't earn. So wouldn't it be valuable, Machiavelli says to himself, if I could provide some information about where Caesar Borgia screwed up? And that's the story that he tells here. He acquired his state, he says, during the ascendancy of his father, and on his decline he lost it, notwithstanding that he had taken every measure and done all that ought to be done by a wise and able man to fix firmly his roots in the state, which the arms and fortune of others had bestowed on him, because, as stated above, he who has not first laid his foundations may be able with great ability to lay them afterwards, but they will be laid with trouble to the architect and danger to the building. So here is his piece of advice. He says, well, here's what happened with Caesar Borgia. His father was the Pope, the most powerful man in the world, and so he didn't feel like it was necessary for, to really establish a firm rule in the land, which, remember, you have to do by, according to Machiavelli, he's already made clear, by cracking skulls if you need to. And so when finally push came to shove, because he didn't have this powerful father as the Pope anymore, he died, then he tried to lay down those roots and it didn't really work for him. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is, well, if you need to undertake these actions that are going to cement your rule, do them sooner rather than later. The time, in short, for you to burn the city down is when you lay your hands on it, not 10 years later. The time for you to kill the ruling family, or kill the ruler and the people around him, is not 5 years after you get there. It's right now. It's the minute that you march into the city. Because the longer you wait to do those things, the more difficult it's going to be for you to do them, and the less likely it is that those things that you do are going to work. And that's basically what the story that is told in this rather long chapter is about. It's the kind of inside baseball that Machiavelli is offering for how Borgia got into power, why Borgia couldn't keep power, and now you, Lorenzo de' Medici, who will presumably one day be the Duke of this territory, how you can be sure that, that you don't mess up. Chapter 8. Concerning those who have obtained a principality by wickedness. He says, a prince may rise from a private station in two ways. neither of which can be attributed to fortune or genius, yet it is manifest that I must not be silent on them, although one could be more copiously treated when I discuss republics. So, and these methods, he says, are either by some wicked or nefarious ways one ascends to the principality, or when by the favor of his fellow citizens a private person becomes the prince of his country. So either in some underhanded way you have become the ruler of this territory. You have cheated or lied, or you came in not under conditions of war, having sort of rightly conquered his territory, but rather by assassinating the previous leader as a member of that community. And that's what he's talking about when he talks about wicked or nefarious ways, or by a claim. When in favor of his fellow citizens, a private person becomes the prince of his country. So he gives his examples, and again, the most important example in the reading for tonight, at least, is the example of the Borgias and Pope Alexander, which is why I spent a little bit of time on it. Machiavelli is sort of really good at using historical examples that were probably important in the late 15th, early 16th century, but don't have much resonance today. The Borgia example is at least actually sort of relevant to him personally. Less important than the examples that he gives is the sort of the lessons that he draws. So pick up here. Hence it is to be reminded that in seizing a state, the usurper ought to examine closely into all those injuries which it is necessary for him to inflict, and to do them all at one stroke so as not to have to repeat them daily. And thus by not unsettling men he will be able to reassure them and win them to himself by benefits. First of all, what is a usurper? Does anybody know what that word means? Yeah. I'm sorry? Well, a person who kills the ruler, provided that they then become the ruler themselves, would be a usurper, but it's not always necessary that it happen through violence. But it's basically any person. A usurper is any person who seizes power by unjust means, whether it's through violence, whether it's through cheating, anything like that, basically. And the lesson here is sort of the same as the other ones, but really it is sort of, if you look at it kind of like a mathematical relationship. And here is the most extreme example, but it's the same relationship that exists in the other examples that he's given. Basically, he says, like, the more tenuous your hold on power from the standpoint of it being justified, the more likely it is you're going to have to use violence. And so, if you are a well-loved ruler who inherits rule over a territory that's been in your family for generations and generations, and everybody loves your family, and for that matter, they've loved you since you were a kid, and now they're really happy that you're the ruler, your need to use violence is going to be virtually non-existent. If you are a person who got into power because you cheated and lied and maybe killed people, then you're going to be suspect from the minute that you walk in, and your ability to maintain rule is going to be extremely tenuous. And therefore, your need to use violence is going to be at the absolute upper limit. And as the previous chapters and examples have shown, you got to do it right away. What you're not going to do is wait. He who does otherwise, either from timidity or evil advice, is always compelled to keep the knife in his hand. Neither can he rely on his subjects, nor can they attach themselves to him, owing to their continued and repeated wrongs. So he says if you don't, then you're going to have to deal with an extended period of distrust. People will turn on you. You won't know when, and you won't know whom for that matter, and so your ability to trust will be significantly diluted. For injuries ought to be done all at one time, so that being tasted less, they offend less. Benefits ought to be given little by little, so that the favor of them may last longer. So, in sort of real and concrete terms, his lesson here is, well, if you've got to kill 10 guys to cement your rule, kill them all in one day. Because if you kill one every day for 10 days, that's going to leave a worse taste in people's mouths than if you do it all in one shot. And yeah, like the actual individual action of you doing that will be awful, more awful than any of the individual cases. But the extent in terms of time of the display of violence is going to be ultimately more difficult for people to bear than it will be for you to do sort of a big action all at once. And above all, a prince ought to live amongst his people in such a way that no unexpected circumstances, whether of good or evil, shall make him change. Because if the necessity for this comes in troubled times, you are too late for harsh measures, and mild ones will not help. So let's talk about this in modern terms for a moment. So let's assume that there's a country, and in this country there's a leader, and this leader is controversial, and it's not clear, and it sort of remains unclear from the very moment that this person enters office that that their leadership is legitimate. If that person comes into office and does not immediately clear the decks, then that person leaves the opportunity for those people that they've left in their offices to begin to work against him. Right? So the current case that we have in the United States, and this particular case, by the way, doesn't regard whether or not the president did anything wrong or did everything wrong. The mere fact that his election was as controversial as it was, and this is like the one lesson that I could draw out of this that actually sort of obtains. So what the president did was, and he did, by the way, what every president does before him, is that he fired all of the district attorneys that work for the Department of Justice. And every administration does that. It's like one of the first things that they do, because they want people in the Justice Department that are loyal to their particular administration. President Trump waited, I think it was 2 months. And in particular, one of the people that he left in office was Preet Bharara, the assistant district attorney for Lower Manhattan, which is where the president, by the way, had been doing business for decades and decades. So the lesson that could be drawn for this situation, and again, it doesn't matter if he's guilty of what's been charged or not guilty of what's been charged or anything like that, but if you were going to fire all the assistant district attorneys, again, like every other president has done before him, do it on the first day. Don't do it 6 weeks in, and leave those guys in place to still have access to all the material that they have access to and begin to then build cases. Because those cases that are going to be coming down against the guys that worked, I should say past tense, for the president, those would be much more difficult cases to make if he had not left Preet Bharara in for 6 weeks, if he had not left the other assistant attorney general, for that matter, who he didn't fire until she criticized him publicly. Then he fired her. Those cases would be weeks, maybe months down the road rather than happening now. Again, it doesn't matter if he's guilty or not. The point is that if you want to make sure that the people are loyal to you, you've got to clear the decks. And this is what he's saying. Now, look, if he had come in like, I don't know, like Roosevelt on his 4th term, where, you know, he's in the process, where he's cured the Depression, he's in, you know, the process, you know, the war, the end of the war is in sight, and you have just won an unprecedented 4th term as president, and everybody literally loves you, then maybe you can dally around a bit and not worry about making sure that your newest administration has a completely new personnel, right? But when your inauguration is met by public protests all over the country, that's probably a sign to you that you're in this situation, and that maybe then making sure that everybody is loyal to you is supposed to be your first order of business. Again, just to be clear, not a statement about whether he's guilty or not guilty, a statement about the tactics of a person who, with diminished or non-existent popularity, needs to cement his rule. Last chapter, concerning a civil principality, but coming to the other point, where a leading citizen becomes the prince of his country, not by wickedness or in any intolerable violence, but by the favor of his fellow citizens, this may be called a civil principality, nor is genius or fortune altogether necessary to attain it, but rather a happy shrewdness. Happy here meaning not like glad or gleeful, but happy meaning like fortunate. This may be called a civil principality, nor is, sorry, I read that already. I say then that such a principality is obtained either by the favor of the people or by the favor of the nobles, because in all cities these two distinct parties are found. And from this it arises that the people do not wish to be ruled nor oppressed by the nobles, and the nobles wish to rule and oppress the people. And from these two opposite desires there arises in cities one of three results, either a principality, self-government, or anarchy. So here the dispute is not between the ruler and the people, it's between the people and the group around the ruler, right? When he talks about the nobles. And in the late 15th, early 16th centuries, the nobles would be hereditary aristocracy, dukes, counts and stuff like that. But in a modern situation, it would just be the elites from whatever sort of elite circles were in the country. So the dispute would be between not the ruler himself or herself, but rather between other people who hold positions in government. Would be the analogous situation. And he says, when a situation like this arises, where there's tension between the common people and the elites, then three things can happen: principality, self-government, or anarchy. A principality is created either by the people or by the nobles, accordingly as one or the other of them has the opportunity. And basically what he says here is that what happens is that either the people or the nobles choose their guy to be the prince, and that side basically in the dispute wins. He who obtains sovereignty by the assistance of the nobles maintains himself with more difficulty than he who comes to it by the aid of the people, because the former finds himself with many around him who consider themselves his equals, and because of this he can neither rule nor manage them to his liking. But he who reaches sovereignty by popular favor finds himself alone and has none around him or few who are not prepared to obey him. So here's what he says. If you rise to power from the support of the elites, that doesn't do you any favors. First of all, he says they're fewer in number, and second of all, they think that they're as good as you, and so your ability to command them is going to be diminished. Second, if you get the rule of the people, not only are there more of them, but they think you're great because they think that you're better than they are. And so that's actually the better situation, to have the support of the people. So he says, well, so what is then the deal with the nobles, with the elites, with the people who consider themselves to be on a peer status with you as the leader? He says, I say that the nobles ought to be looked at mainly in two ways. They either shape their course in such a way as binds them to your fortune, or they do not. Those who so bind themselves and are not rapacious ought to be honored and loved. Those who do not bind themselves may be dealt with in two ways. Either they don't do so because they lack courage and loyalty to you, in which case you ought to make use of them, especially of those who are of good counsel. And thus, whilst in prosperity, you honor yourself and you don't have to fear them. And then when, you're done with them, you can sort of throw them aside. Thus, whilst in prosperity you honor yourself, in adversity you have not to fear them. But when for their own ambitions' ends they shun binding themselves, it is a token that they are giving more thought to themselves than to you. And a prince ought to guard against such and to fear them as if they were open enemies, because in adversity they always help to ruin them. So don't trust people that have their own sense of ambition. You're better in dealing with people who consider themselves to be your equals, who are of the elites from which you presumably have yourself arisen, that you rely on toadies, basically, and not people that have their own independent way of doing things. As far as the person that arises with the help of the people rather than with the help of the nobles, of the elites, He says, it's necessary that you keep them friendly. This can be, you can easily do by seeing that they only ask not to be oppressed. But one who in opposition to the people becomes a prince by the favor of the nobles ought above everything to seek to win the people over to himself, and this he may easily do if he takes them under his protection. So basically his advice here is that the people are the better bet, because ultimately you have to do less to please them. If they feel like that they are going to rely on you for their protection, that's a very powerful position to be in. Because men, he says, when they receive good from him of whom they were expecting evil, are bound more closely to their benefactor. Thus the people quickly become more devoted to him than if he had been raised to the principality by their favors. So he makes an interesting point here, which is this. He says, and it's actually a point on which he then continues to expand for several more chapters, and much of the advice, and in fact, the chapters that you have in the textbook from Machiavelli deal with this point rather than with the point of using force and when, is, well, how do you best keep the people on your side? And he says, well, he says, first of all, well, you might have heard that the expression that anybody that builds on the people builds on mud. That if you build on the people, you're building on an unstable surface, because the people's opinions about you can shift and all of this. He says, no, that's not true. You can firm the people up, but there's just a way that you have to go about to do it. You have to be sure that that they fear you but don't hate you. That if possible that they love you, but if it comes down to them fearing or loving you, it's better they fear you. Just not so much that they can't stand that situation and they look to overthrow you. It's a matter, basically, he says at great length, it's a matter of finesse, of getting the right balance. Don't, he says, be overly cruel. But don't, on the other hand, be overly generous, because then if you have to be cruel for some reason, they're going to take it much worse. So, if, say, the economy in the country is doing well, don't cut taxes to nothing, because ultimately someday economy is going to be not so good and you're going to have to raise taxes on them again. Keep taxes at a low level and make sure that they're always paying them. That way, if you have to bump up taxes, it's not so much that they can't stand it. It's not coming out of nowhere. You haven't been so generous in the past that now that's all they expect of you. Machiavelli doesn't have a lot of regard or respect for the common people. But he recognizes that ultimately because, first of all, they're more numerous, as already noted, and second of all, because they are more easily persuadable, they're a better foundation than people who are closer to you as a ruler's station in life. Because those people, they have ambition, and they're going to want favors from you, and they're going to see themselves as closer to you than the people do, and as a result of that, they're going to want to undermine what it is that you're trying to do. Last paragraph. So these principalities, he says, and these again are principalities, civil principalities, are liable to danger when they are passing from the civil to the absolute order of government, for such princes either rule personally or through magistrates. So here he says, well, and remember there's sort of three possibilities that he says: principality, self-government, or anarchy. He doesn't, by the way, deal with self-government or anarchy, because that's not what the book is about, right? The book is about how does a prince maintain power. But he says, sort of inherent in that is that this is going to be, it's not going to be like an enlightened rulership. If you are a prince and you seek to maintain your power, that means that you are seeking to maintain as much power as possible. When he talks about absolute order of government, he's not talking about that it'll be like a monarchy like England is today, where there's, democratic elections and a parliament and a prime minister and all of that. This is, much closer to the model that today you would see in Saudi Arabia, where the, ultimate power is held by the king. And so he says that because you, as a prince in coming to this position of leading over this city, now have to establish this absolute order, this has to be done carefully as well. Because, as he says, this transition from you just being one of them, or for that matter, just being one of the elite, but even rising through a claim, it necessarily becomes necessary for you to establish a firm grip on power, and that, he says, can be difficult. Such princes, he says, either rule personally or through magistrates. So they either directly rule the people, or they set up, offices of government to do it for them. In the latter case, he says, government is weaker and more insecure because it rests entirely on the goodwill of those citizens who are raised to the magistracy, and who, especially in troubled times, can destroy the government with great ease, either by intrigue or open defiance. If you rely on office holders to administer the state, then you run the risk of your power being diminished. And the prince has not the chance amid tumults to exercise absolute authority, because the citizens and subjects accustomed to receive orders from magistrates are not of a mind to obey him, and these confusions. So he sets up a difficult situation. He says, on the one hand, if you set up magistrates, then they can destroy the government from within. He says if you don't set them up, the people aren't going to know what to do with that, because that's the way that they've done things. They're accustomed, he says, to receiving orders from magistrates. And if they don't see sort of faces that they recognize in government that they can trust, then their trust in you as the topmost person in that government will be shaken. For such a prince cannot rely on what he observes in quiet times when citizens had need of the state, because then everyone agrees with him. They all promise, and when death is far distant, they all wish to die for him. But in troubled times, when the state has need of its citizens, then he finds but few. So this is another sort of key takeaway of his advice, generally speaking, which is that don't make the mistake of thinking when things are easy that that's the way that things are always going to go. You have, you might have the elites on your side, you might have the people on your side, you may have both on your side, but either of them can turn when times get difficult. And so much the more is this experiment dangerous, in as much as it can only be tried once. Very plainly stated, you only get to screw up once in this position. If you make a big enough mistake, they can remove you. And then the fundamental underlying goal of everything that I've been talking about now for 9 chapters will come to naught. Therefore, a wise prince ought to adopt such a course that his citizens will always, in every sort and kind of circumstance, have need of the state and of him, and then he will always find them faithful. So, the last point here is that not only are things like physical force necessary to attaining and maintaining one's hold on power, but ultimately making people feel as if the state is necessary to their well-being is also a key to your maintaining power. Because they might get rid of you because they don't like you, or they might get rid of you because they just don't like the system anymore. In either case, the end result is the same. You're gone. So you have to sort of cover both of your bases. You have to be sure that you're an able enough ruler that they don't want to get rid of you and replace you with somebody else. But you also have to be sure that they just don't see you as superfluous and everybody else that you brought along with you. Or, for that matter, decide to change the form of government that they're living under, or abolish their government altogether. So how do you do that? How do you assure the people that they need government? Not just, I mean, you can convince them that you need your government in a number of ways. So there's actually 2 things to consider. The first is, how do you convince people that they need your governance? And he's already talked about that to some extent, right? The biggest thing is you're supposed to make them feel protected. That by virtue of your leadership, they are safer than they would be without you. So, but that's not the only way that people stay in power. So what are other ways that people are supposed to maintain their power, other than just the idea that if you don't have me, then your physical safety is going to be greatly diminished? Why do people vote for one political party over the other? To some extent, foreign policy, military policy, their stance on a war that might be going on will be part of that, but it's not going to be all of it. What do people run on office on? Yeah.
They promise to change something that citizens don't like.
Like what?
Like
The economy is a big one, right? So if you vote for me, your taxes will go down. If you vote for me, their taxes will go up. So there's and a big thing that that presidents in particular run on is growth of the economy overall, right? If you vote for me or you vote for my party, then either these bad economic times will no longer be the case; they'll get better, or these great economic times that we've been having, they'll either continue or they'll get even better. Are there any other reasons other than safety and some economic reward?